George Harrison was never the loudest voice in the room, and that was exactly how the world came to know him. Soft-spoken, introspective, and often guarded, he rarely aired grievances in public or lashed out in interviews. Yet beneath that calm exterior lived emotions that were complex, unresolved, and deeply human. Within the Beatles, George often felt like the quiet observer in a band driven by bigger personalities and louder creative forces. His frustrations were not explosive or dramatic. They simmered quietly over years. While fans often focus on the more visible tensions between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, George's inner struggle unfolded more subtly. He admired his bandmates, learned from them, and loved the music they created together. But admiration can coexist with frustration, and over time, those feelings became harder to ignore. George's story is not about anger, but about being unheard. Entering a world that wasn't built for him, George Harrison joined the future Beatles as a teenager, stepping into a group already shaped by John Lennon and Paul McCartney's chemistry. When Paul introduced George to John on a Liverpool bus in the late 1950s, George was young, eager, and immensely talented, but still finding his voice. Lennon and McCartney were already forming the creative center, writing songs, setting direction, and defining the band's identity. George followed, learned, and adapted. In the early years, this dynamic made sense. He absorbed everything, sharpened his skills, and contributed where he could. But as the band evolved, so did George. He began writing more, experimenting musically, and seeking creative independence. Yet the structure of the Beatles left limited space for that growth. What began as patience slowly turned into quiet frustration, not because George lacked opportunity, but because his contributions often came last. Fame, labels, and the weight of being quiet. As Beatlemania swept the world, George was branded the Quiet Beatle, a label that stuck for life. While it reflected his reserved personality, it also simplified a much deeper reality. Being quiet did not mean lacking ideas or ambition. Inside the studio, George often brought thoughtful suggestions, unique chord progressions, and evolving musical concepts. Yet his ideas were sometimes overlooked or revised heavily. Paul McCartney, driven by perfection and structure, naturally took control during sessions, shaping arrangements down to the smallest detail. While this wasn't malicious, it could feel stifling. George later reflected that years of subtle correction affected his confidence, especially as a guitarist. The challenge wasn't talent, it was space. In a band where two dominant writers shaped nearly everything, finding room to grow required more than patience. It required being heard, something George quietly struggled to achieve. When the studio became a breaking point by the late 1960s, the internal balance of the Beatles was unraveling. During the White Album and Let It Be sessions, tension replaced collaboration. Paul's leadership intensified, John became increasingly distracted, and George reached his limit. One now famous exchange during rehearsals captured the strain perfectly. Calmly but firmly, George told Paul he would play whatever Paul wanted, or nothing at all. The moment wasn't sarcastic or explosive, it was exhausted honesty. It reflected years of feeling directed rather than included. Shortly after, George temporarily left the band, not out of anger, but self-preservation. Though he returned under revised agreements, something fundamental had shifted. His creativity flourished when given freedom, resulting in songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun. Yet while his music soared, the emotional distance within the band quietly widened, especially between George and Paul. After the breakup, words finally found space. When the Beatles ended in 1970, George experienced both relief and reckoning. Free from creative limitations, he released All Things Must Pass, an album that revealed the depth of material he had carried for years. It wasn't an act of revenge, but expression. Songs like Wah Wah captured emotional noise rather than personal attacks, reflecting frustration more than blame. Legal disputes followed the breakup, adding strain to already fragile relationships. Paul's lawsuit to formally dissolve the Beatles' partnership, while practical, felt emotionally final to George. The separation was no longer just artistic, it was personal. Though public appearances remained polite, private feelings were harder to resolve. George didn't seek confrontation. Instead, he processed through music, reflection, and distance. His solo success proved his ability, but it didn't erase the emotional weight of years spent feeling secondary within a band he helped define. A complex bond with Paul McCartney. George Harrison never described Paul McCartney as cruel, but he did describe working with him as overwhelming. In later interviews, George spoke candidly about how years of collaboration affected his confidence. He acknowledged Paul's talent and dedication, while also noting how control and perfectionism can unintentionally limit others. For George, the issue was never ego, it was creative space. He once remarked that he could imagine working with John again, but not Paul, a statement that reflected fatigue rather than hostility. Even during the 1990s anthology project, old patterns resurfaced. George found himself bristling at direction, while Paul admitted they still irritated each other. They remained respectful, even affectionate at times, but never fully at ease. Their relationship wasn't built on hatred, but on unresolved dynamics that time softened without fully erasing. John Lennon. Admiration that turned distant. If George's frustration with Paul was about control, his pain with John Lennon was about distance. Early on, George idolized John, viewing him as a mentor and creative guide. But as John's personal life changed, so did their connection. Lennon became less engaged, sometimes dismissive of George's interests, particularly his deepening spirituality and exploration of Indian music. Where George sought meaning, John often responded with irony. The emotional shift hurt more than creative disagreements ever could. This quiet estrangement became evident years later, when George's memoir barely mentioned Lennon at all. It wasn't bitterness, it was absence. After Lennon's death in 1980, George honored him with music that acknowledged both their bond and their distance. The tribute was sincere, restrained, and honest, much like George himself. Some relationships, even meaningful ones, leave scars that never fully disappear. Peace. That came slowly and incompletely. In his later years, George Harrison lived far from the chaos of Beatlemania, embracing family life, philanthropy, and spiritual reflection. He rarely revisited the Beatles unless asked, and when he did, his tone was thoughtful but unsentimental. Reunions happened, conversations softened, and age brought perspective. When George fell ill in the late 1990s, Paul McCartney visited him quietly, without cameras or statements. They talked, joked, and shared a moment neither could have imagined decades earlier. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, but it didn't need to be. George's final public words emphasized love over resentment, wisdom over conflict. Peace for him wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about accepting it without bitterness. Some wounds heal fully. Others simply stop hurting as much. The legacy of a man who didn't shout. George Harrison's legacy is often described through his music, spirituality, and quiet rebellion. But equally important is what he chose not to do. He didn't shout, attack, or rewrite history to favor himself. Instead, he allowed complexity to exist. He loved deeply, felt frustration honestly, and carried pain without turning it into spectacle. His story reminds us that not all conflicts are loud, and not all forgiveness is complete. George wasn't the loudest Beatle, but his voice endures because it was sincere. In the end, he left behind melodies that healed, words that searched for meaning, and a life that reflected growth rather than grievance. His silence was never weakness. It was restraint. And sometimes silence speaks louder than anything else.